The Siberian divisions, composed primarily of troops from the far eastern regions of the Soviet Union, played a pivotal role in the broader context of World War II. The geopolitical situation leading to their formation and deployment was rooted in both the unique climatic conditions of the Soviet Union and the growing global tensions that shaped the course of the war. To understand the strategic significance of the Siberian divisions and their expertise in cold-weather warfare, one must first consider the conditions leading up to the war, as well as the geography and resources that influenced Soviet military strategy. By the early 1940s, Europe was gripped by the expansionist policies of Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin found itself in a precarious position, caught between the growing power of Germany to the west and the political and military demands of its allies. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in 1939, had temporarily shielded the USSR from direct conflict with Germany. However, tensions remained high, and Stalin sought to strengthen his position by expanding Soviet military capabilities, particularly in the face of the looming threat posed by the Nazi war machine. One of the more significant aspects of the Soviet military structure was the division of resources across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. The Siberian regions, with their remote and harsh climate, had historically been viewed as an area for the storage of military reserves. Despite this, the soldiers of Siberia, often seen as outsiders by their more Western counterparts, would soon prove their worth in the most extreme conditions of warfare. The harsh climate of Siberia, characterized by freezing winters, deep snow, and temperatures regularly plunging to 40 degrees Celsius, had an outsized influence on the training, organization, and mindset of the soldiers hailing from the region. The difficulty of life in these areas produced a unique breed of soldier, accustomed to enduring severe cold and working under challenging conditions. It was this expertise that would prove to be invaluable when the Germans, in their infamous Operation Barbarossa, launched an invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The arrival of German forces on the Eastern Front pushed the Soviet Union to re-examine its military readiness. German forces advanced rapidly through the Soviet territories in the summer of 1941. But they had significantly underestimated the strategic and environmental challenges they would encounter, particularly in the winter months. The German army, trained primarily for more temperate climates and designed for Blitzkrieg-style warfare, was poorly equipped for the severe cold that characterized the Russian winters. The lack of proper winter clothing, inadequate vehicles, and poorly maintained equipment created serious problems for the German forces. As the Soviet Union faced the brutal onslaught of the German invasion, Stalin recognized the need for more than just tactical adjustments. He needed reinforcements that could not only withstand the harsh conditions, but could leverage them to inflict maximum damage on the German forces. The solution lay in the Siberian divisions, elite units of soldiers trained to fight in the coldest and most inhospitable environments in the world. Siberian soldiers, having spent their lives accustomed to the bone-chilling winters of the region, were uniquely suited for cold-weather combat. The training they received in their remote homeland taught them to function in sub-zero temperatures, with many having already lived through long winters with little access to heating or insulation. These soldiers, familiar with the harshness of their environment, were able to maintain high morale and operational efficiency, even when facing conditions that would have caused significant difficulties for other units. Moreover, these divisions were highly disciplined and well organized, having been part of a long-standing Soviet military tradition that emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and readiness in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Siberian divisions were quickly mobilized and dispatched to the front lines, often to reinforce Soviet positions that were under heavy pressure from the advancing German forces. As the Germans pressed their offensive toward Moscow, the Soviet leadership recognized that winter was approaching, and with it, the possibility of a protracted conflict. The Siberian divisions were called upon not only for their military skills, but for their ability to endure the brutal cold and adapt to the environment. Stalin's decision to send these experienced soldiers to the front lines of the battle for Moscow proved to be a critical turning point in the war, allowing the Soviets to stem the German advance during the winter months of 1941–42. The deployment of the Siberian divisions during this critical phase of the war would become a defining moment in the Soviet response to the Nazi invasion. The Soviet Union's ability to turn the tide of the war in part relied on these troops' familiarity with cold weather warfare, which would later play a significant role in the overall outcome of the conflict. The cold weather experience of the Siberian divisions, along with their intimate knowledge of the terrain and climate, allowed them to successfully execute operations that left the German forces vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks. As the winter months set in, the Germans, who had initially expected a quick victory, found themselves trapped in a war of attrition, unable to adapt to the freezing temperatures and harsh conditions of the Soviet winter. The unique skills of the Siberian divisions not only shaped the course of the war on the Eastern Front, but also highlighted the importance of terrain and climate in shaping military strategy. In the battle for Moscow, the German forces faced not only the Soviet military's resilience, but also the daunting challenge of fighting against an environment that favored the defenders rather than the invaders. The Siberian divisions embodied the Soviet Union's ability to adapt to the harshest of conditions, and their role in the defense of Moscow marked a significant shift in the war's trajectory. The contribution of the Siberian divisions and their ability to conduct successful operations in extreme conditions was crucial to the ultimate Soviet victory in the war. Their expertise in cold weather warfare would go on to influence the Soviet approach to military operations throughout the rest of the war, and their success in resisting the German invasion would set the stage for Soviet offensives that would eventually push the Germans back and lead to their ultimate defeat. The outbreak of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, marked the beginning of one of the most intense and catastrophic military campaigns in history. The German Wehrmacht, having launched a surprise attack on the Soviet Union, advanced rapidly through the Western Soviet territories, aiming to destroy the Soviet state within a matter of months. For the civilian population, the first days of the invasion were a whirlwind of chaos, fear, and uncertainty. Soviet authorities, who had initially underestimated the scale of the German assault, scrambled to organize a defense, but the German offensive pushed forward with lightning speed. While the Soviet leadership was in a state of disarray, the Siberian divisions, which had previously been stationed in the eastern regions of the Soviet Union, were not immediately called upon for the initial defense. The Soviet leadership, which had not yet fully anticipated the scale of the attack, had kept these elite units in reserve, relying on forces closer to the front lines. However, as the situation worsened, it became increasingly apparent that the Soviets would need every available resource to hold back the advancing German forces. The vast expanse of Soviet territory, combined with the speed of the German advance, made it difficult for the Red Army to organize a coherent defense. The Germans used their Blitzkrieg tactics to quickly overrun Soviet positions, isolating large portions of the Soviet military and cutting off supply lines. For civilians living in the affected areas, the experience was one of total upheaval. Towns and villages were occupied, and many civilians found themselves caught between the advancing German forces and the retreating Soviet military. In the early stages of the war, the civilian population faced not only the threat of military occupation, but also the sudden collapse of the social order. The Soviet government, in its haste to organize a response, implemented forced evacuations in many areas. Civilians were often uprooted from their homes and sent to remote regions of the Soviet Union to escape the advancing German forces. In many cases, these evacuations were poorly organized, and civilians were left to fend for themselves, with little in the way of resources or protection. The Siberian divisions, with their unique training and ability to endure harsh winter conditions, were eventually mobilized and sent to the front lines. Their deployment came at a critical time, as the German forces were advancing toward Moscow, the Soviet capital. Stalin, recognizing the importance of holding the city, made the decision to send these elite units to reinforce Soviet defenses. The Siberian divisions, composed of soldiers who had spent their lives in the harsh climates of the Soviet East, were uniquely suited for the task at hand. Their ability to endure the cold, navigate through snow-covered terrain, and adapt to the challenging conditions of the Russian winter made them invaluable assets to the Soviet war effort. These soldiers had trained in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth, and their experience would prove crucial in the coming months. The arrival of the Siberian divisions on the front lines marked the beginning of a crucial phase in the war. These divisions, having been stationed in Siberia, were well accustomed to the bitter cold and the grueling conditions that would soon face both the Red Army and the invading Germans. The winter months, which would soon set in, were a major factor in the outcome of the war, and the Siberian divisions were key in turning the tide of the conflict. The initial German assault on the Soviet Union had been a stunning success. The speed of the German advance was unmatched, and the Wehrmacht was able to encircle and destroy large portions of the Soviet military. The Germans had anticipated a quick victory, believing that the Soviet Union would be unable to withstand the sheer force of their military. However, the Germans underestimated not only the resilience of the Soviet military, but also the harsh environmental conditions they would face as they advanced further east. For the German forces, the reality of the Russian winter soon became apparent. The Wehrmacht, which had been trained for rapid, mechanized warfare in more temperate climates, was ill-prepared for the extreme cold and the challenges posed by the vast Soviet terrain. The lack of proper winter clothing and the mechanical failure of equipment, including vehicles and artillery, severely hindered the Germans' ability to maintain their momentum. The Siberian divisions, on the other hand, were well equipped for the brutal conditions of the Russian winter. As the Germans continued their advance toward Moscow, the Siberian divisions dug in and began to fight back. The harsh winter, combined with the strategic advantage of the Siberian forces' expertise in cold-weather warfare, soon proved to be a decisive factor. The Red Army, reinforced by the Siberian divisions, began to mount a series of counteroffensives, pushing the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow. The Siberian divisions were not only instrumental in repelling the German advance, but also in bolstering the morale of the Soviet forces and the civilian population. The presence of these experienced troops, who had already endured some of the harshest conditions in the world, provided hope and motivation to both soldiers and civilians alike. The Soviet government, though initially caught off guard by the German invasion, began to harness the resolve and resilience of the Siberian troops to rally the population and the military in a unified effort to resist the Germans. By the time the German forces reached the gates of Moscow in late 1941, the Soviet defense was beginning to solidify. The Siberian divisions, which had been mobilized from the farthest reaches of the Soviet Union, became the backbone of the defense of the Soviet capital. They were deployed in critical sectors of the front, where their experience in winter warfare proved invaluable. As the temperature dropped, the Germans, ill-prepared for the cold, found themselves unable to maintain their rapid advance. The Siberian divisions, on the other hand, fought with an intensity and endurance that would prove critical in halting the German offensive. The battle for Moscow in the winter of 1941-42 became one of the most significant turning points in World War II. The Germans, exhausted by their failed assault on the city and unable to cope with the extreme winter conditions, were forced to retreat. The Soviet victory at Moscow was a symbol of Soviet resilience and marked the beginning of the German retreat on the Eastern Front. The Siberian divisions, having played a crucial role in the defense of Moscow, earned a place in history as key contributors to the Soviet victory. Their expertise in cold-weather warfare not only helped the Soviet Union defend its capital, but also paved the way for subsequent Soviet offensives that would eventually push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. For the civilians who had lived through the horror of the German advance, the arrival of the Siberian divisions and the Soviet victory at Moscow was a moment of hope and relief. The Soviet Union had endured, and the civilian population, having suffered greatly under German occupation, began to see the possibility of liberation. But the victory came at a high cost. The destruction of Soviet cities, the displacement of millions, and the loss of life left deep scars on the civilian population. The war was far from over, but for many civilians, the Soviet victory at Moscow was a sign that victory was possible, and the resilience of the Soviet people would carry them through the trials to come. In the lead-up to Operation Barbarossa, both the German and Soviet military had specific strategic goals, shaped by their respective ideologies, military doctrines, and geographical considerations. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was driven by Adolf Hitler's desire to secure Lebensraum, living space for the German people, destroy Soviet communism, and gain access to vital resources, especially oil from the Caucasus. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was determined to protect its vast territory and defend its way of life, which was now under threat from the advancing German forces. The strategic objectives of both sides were aligned with the larger ideological struggle that defined World War II. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, sought to expand their influence and subjugate the Soviet Union, while the Allies, including the Soviet Union, fought to preserve their sovereignty and push back the Nazi menace. From the German perspective, the primary objective of Operation Barbarossa was to deliver a rapid, decisive blow to the Soviet Union. The German High Command, led by Hitler, believed that the Red Army could be destroyed in a quick series of encirclements, and that the Soviet state would collapse under the pressure of a lightning war. The Germans used their Blitzkrieg tactics, which had been successful in Poland and France, to launch a fast-paced invasion along three major axes. Army Group North aimed toward Leningrad, Army Group Center headed for Moscow, and Army Group South moved toward Kiev and the oil-rich regions of Ukraine. The Germans believed that the Soviet Union's logistical shortcomings, combined with the disarray in Soviet military leadership after Stalin's purges, would enable them to achieve victory within a few months. The strategic plan relied on the German forces' mobility, using mechanized infantry, tanks, and air support to outpace and overwhelm Soviet defenses. German intelligence also reported that the Soviet Union was underprepared for war, and that its military was in disarray. The Germans anticipated that the Soviet army, still recovering from Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, would crumble in the face of a concentrated and rapid German offensive. In Hitler's mind, the Red Army would collapse under the weight of this onslaught, leaving the Soviet Union vulnerable to occupation and occupation. On the Soviet side, the initial goal was simple: to defend the Soviet Union from the advancing Nazi forces and preserve the integrity of the Soviet state. However, the scale of the German invasion required an immediate shift in strategy. Stalin and his generals were forced to respond to the fast-moving Germans with limited resources. The initial Soviet strategy was one of defense in depth, attempting to delay the German advance and buying time to organize a counteroffensive. The Soviet military leadership also recognized the importance of the Soviet heartland and the need to protect Moscow, Leningrad, and key industrial regions in Ukraine. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Soviet Union had undertaken significant military preparations, although these proved insufficient to counter the speed and ferocity of the German assault. Stalin, believing in the strength of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the unlikely nature of a German invasion, had focused much of the Soviet military's efforts on guarding the western border and strengthening its defenses in Poland. Despite warning signs, including intelligence reports from spies and satellite states about an impending German invasion, the Soviets were unprepared for the scale and speed of the German attack. Initially, the Soviet strategy called for the use of strategic depth to counter the German invasion, with the hope that the vast distances of the Soviet Union would limit the Germans' ability to supply their forces. This would involve the retreat of Soviet forces into the interior to regroup and prepare for a counterattack. However, as the Germans advanced, They quickly encircled large numbers of Soviet soldiers, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the early days of the conflict. One of the primary logistical challenges that the Soviets faced was the lack of effective transportation infrastructure. The vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with the challenges of moving equipment, supplies, and troops across the country's vast expanse, limited the speed of the Soviet response. The Germans, with their well-organized and efficient supply lines, were able to maintain their rapid advance, while the Soviet forces struggled to maintain the necessary levels of support for their own operations. The Germans, under the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse within months, did not plan for a prolonged campaign. Their initial strategy was based on speed and surprise, with the expectation that once Soviet resistance broke, the Soviet Union's industrial and logistical capabilities would be neutralized. However, as the Germans advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the challenges of winter, harsh terrain, and extended supply lines began to take their toll. By the end of the summer of 1941, the Germans had made significant territorial gains, but their supply lines were becoming stretched, and their forces were exhausted. The expected collapse of the Soviet military did not occur, and the Red Army, despite its early setbacks, began to regroup and reorganize. Stalin's decision to relocate vital industrial plants eastward, away from the advancing German front lines, helped maintain Soviet production capabilities. This move ensured that the Soviet Union could continue to supply its military with the necessary armaments, even as the Germans made significant gains on the battlefield. As the Germans advanced, the Soviet leadership realized that the defense of Moscow was critical to the survival of the Soviet Union. The Soviet command called for the mobilization of additional forces, including the Siberian divisions, which had been held in reserve in the east. These divisions, composed of soldiers experienced in cold-weather warfare, were urgently brought to the front lines as the German forces approached the capital. The Siberian divisions, accustomed to the harsh conditions of the Russian winter, would play a crucial role in the defense of Moscow in the coming months. The deployment of these Siberian divisions marked a significant shift in Soviet military strategy. While the initial Soviet strategy had focused on defensive lines and delaying the Germans, the reinforcements from Siberia would allow for more aggressive counterattacks and a more concerted defense. The presence of these experienced soldiers also provided a significant morale boost to the Red Army, as they were seen as a symbol of the Soviet Union's ability to endure the harshest of conditions and continue the fight against the Nazis. The strategic planning of both the German and Soviet forces ultimately led to a brutal, protracted conflict, in which the civilians of Soviet territory played a critical role in the war's outcome. For the civilians, particularly those in the path of the advancing German forces, survival became the primary goal. As German forces pressed deeper into Soviet territory, the civilian experience was shaped by a constant threat of occupation, forced labor, mass executions, and the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. Despite the failures of initial German planning and the unforeseen resilience of the Soviet civilian population, the Germans continued their offensive throughout the summer and into the fall. The conflict was far from over, and both sides faced significant challenges in sustaining their efforts. the ideological and military struggle between the two powers would continue to unfold on the frozen plains of the Soviet Union, leading to an outcome that neither side could have anticipated at the outset. The initial phase of Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, marked the beginning of one of the most intense and consequential military campaigns in history. With more than 3 million German soldiers advancing along three key axes toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south, the Wehrmacht unleashed its full force on the Soviet Union. The speed and intensity of the attack stunned both the Soviet military and civilian population, leading to immediate consequences for both sides. As German tanks and infantry pushed forward, the strategic objectives were clear: capture critical Soviet cities, cripple the Red Army, and ultimately destroy the Soviet state. For the Soviet Union, the early days of the invasion were characterized by confusion and chaos. Stalin and his leadership had failed to fully anticipate the scale of the German attack, despite multiple intelligence reports indicating an impending invasion. The Soviet military, still recovering from the purges of the 1930s, was ill-prepared to fend off such a massive assault. The Wehrmacht, operating under Blitzkrieg tactics, moved rapidly, bypassing heavily fortified Soviet positions and encircling entire Soviet armies. As a result, large portions of the Red Army were destroyed or captured within days of the invasion, leaving vast gaps in the Soviet defense. For the civilians living in the path of the advancing German forces, the invasion was nothing short of a nightmare. The Blitzkrieg tactics, which relied on speed and the overwhelming force of combined arms, infantry, armor, and air support, brought destruction to cities, towns, and villages. The civilian population, which had already been dealing with the harsh realities of Soviet rule, was now confronted with the full force of Nazi occupation. While some populations in the Western Soviet territories initially viewed the Germans as liberators, particularly in areas like Ukraine and the Baltic states, where Soviet repression had been severe, the brutal reality of the occupation quickly became apparent. The Germans, while presenting themselves as liberators to some, quickly revealed their genocidal intentions. The initial months of occupation were marked by mass executions, forced labor, and systematic repression. Jews, Romani people, and political dissidents were rounded up and killed in large numbers, and entire populations were displaced. In many cases, civilians were caught in the crossfire between the rapidly advancing German forces and the Soviet military, which was retreating and reorganizing in response to the invasion. The first major clashes between German and Soviet forces occurred in the border regions of the Soviet Union, particularly in the areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. As the Germans advanced, they encountered stiff Soviet resistance, particularly in the more urbanized and industrialized areas. However, the speed and power of the German offensive quickly overwhelmed the Soviet defenders. German forces encircled and destroyed large Soviet formations, particularly in the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk and the Battle of Smolensk, where the Soviets suffered catastrophic losses. By the end of the first week of the invasion, the Germans had captured more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers, further weakening the Red Army's ability to mount an effective defense. One of the most significant early engagements was the Battle of Kiev in the south. German Army Group South, which had advanced from Poland, moved swiftly toward the city, hoping to gain control of the strategic Ukrainian region and its vital agricultural and industrial resources. The Red Army attempted to defend Kiev, but the German forces, utilizing Blitzkrieg tactics, quickly encircled the city. The battle for Kiev became a symbol of Soviet determination, but also a demonstration of the overwhelming power of the German military. After weeks of fierce fighting, Kiev fell to the Germans, and more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. As the German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the toll on the civilian population mounted. The Wehrmacht, adhering to the policies set by the Nazi regime, carried out systematic reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding the Soviet forces. These reprisals included mass executions, deportations, and the destruction of entire villages. Civilians in areas like Belarus and Ukraine faced the wrath of both the German military and the Soviet authorities, who were unable to protect them from the onslaught of violence. The Germans, in line with their racial ideology, treated Soviet civilians as subhuman, often forcing them into labor camps or executing them on the spot for even the slightest suspicion of resistance. For civilians in the occupied territories, the war quickly became a fight for survival. As German forces moved forward, Soviet civilians were often forced to flee their homes, leaving behind their possessions and livelihoods. Many sought refuge in the interior of the Soviet Union, where they faced further hardships as they tried to escape the advancing German armies. The Soviet government, struggling to maintain control over the retreating front lines, organized mass evacuations of civilians from the most threatened areas. However, the scale of the evacuation was insufficient to protect the millions of people living in the path of the German advance. Thousands of civilians were killed as they attempted to flee the fighting, while others were caught in the crossfire between retreating Soviet forces and the advancing Germans. In cities like Leningrad and Moscow, the civilian population faced a different set of challenges. As the Germans advanced, the Soviet leadership recognized the strategic importance of these cities and ordered their defense at all costs. For civilians, this meant living under constant bombardment, facing food shortages, and enduring the psychological toll of living in a war zone. The prospect of German occupation was a terrifying one, and civilians did their best to prepare for the inevitable siege. In Leningrad, for example, the civilian population began to fortify their homes and buildings, knowing that the German forces would likely attempt to lay siege to the city. For the Red Army, the first engagements of the war were catastrophic, with massive losses in both personnel and equipment. The Soviet leadership quickly realized that the defense of the Soviet Union would require more than just a defensive strategy. It would require a complete mobilization of the Soviet people. Stalin, recognizing the dire situation, called upon the entire nation to contribute to the war effort. The Soviet Union underwent a total mobilization, with civilians being conscripted into the military or into work brigades to support the war effort. The first engagements of Operation Barbarossa were a devastating blow to the Soviet Union. However, the scale of the early losses also galvanized the Soviet people. Despite the overwhelming strength of the German military, the Soviets began to regroup and organize a counteroffensive. The Siberian divisions, elite units of soldiers from the coldest regions of the Soviet Union, would soon be called upon to defend key positions and launch counterattacks. These divisions, trained for combat in the harshest conditions, would play a crucial role in halting the German advance and defending Moscow. The war, while devastating, was far from over, and the Soviet Union would soon begin to turn the tide. The first engagements in the early months of Operation Barbarossa revealed the harsh realities of the conflict for both the military and civilian populations. Cities were destroyed, families torn apart, and the Soviet Union faced the existential threat of Nazi occupation. However, the experiences of these early battles also sowed the seeds of Soviet resilience and the determination of the civilian population to survive and resist the occupation would play a crucial role in the Soviet Union's eventual victory. As the German forces continued their advance across the Soviet Union, the scale and brutality of Operation Barbarossa intensified. By mid-1941, the Wehrmacht had made remarkable territorial gains, encircling Soviet armies, capturing strategic cities, and pushing ever closer to the heart of Soviet power. However, as the Germans pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they encountered a series of unforeseen challenges, both on the battlefield and in the occupied territories. For civilians, the escalating crisis became an unbearable cycle of fear, displacement, and loss, while for the German forces, the challenges of sustaining their rapid advance in the vast expanse of the Soviet Union began to surface. The first major escalation occurred as the German army reached the gates of Leningrad and Moscow. The stakes of the campaign became clear. If these cities fell, so too would the Soviet Union's ability to resist the Nazi onslaught. The German command, having been buoyed by rapid success and confident in their ability to break Soviet defenses, shifted its focus to these critical targets. However, the Germans, having underestimated both Soviet resilience and the harshness of the environment, faced mounting difficulties as they neared their objectives. For the civilian populations in Leningrad and Moscow, the situation was one of imminent danger. In Leningrad, the German forces began their siege in the fall of 1941. Cutting off the city from supplies and plunging it into darkness. The civilian population of the city, numbering over 3 million, faced starvation, constant bombardment, and an unrelenting winter. With food supplies dwindling to nothing, residents resorted to extreme measures to survive, eating anything they could find, including pets, leather, and even glue. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, such as heating systems and transportation networks, left the people of Leningrad in dire conditions. Yet, the population of Leningrad proved remarkably resilient. The city's defenders, bolstered by civilians and soldiers alike, held the line against the German siege, despite the immense suffering. This period would become one of the most enduring symbols of Soviet endurance during the war. In Moscow, the German forces reached the outskirts of the city in October 1941. The stakes were equally high. Moscow was the Soviet capital and the center of its military and political apparatus. The German army's strategy was clear: capture the city, destroy the Soviet government, and deliver a final blow to the Red Army. However, the Soviet leadership, under Stalin, was resolute in its decision to defend the capital at all costs. The German advance stalled outside Moscow as the Red Army mobilized its reserves, including the Siberian divisions, which had been held in reserve and were now brought to the front lines. The Siberian divisions, well accustomed to the extreme cold of the Russian winter, played a critical role in halting the German advance. By December 1941, the Soviet military, with the help of these elite units, launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. The Soviet victory was crucial, but the cost of the defense was immense, both for the military and the civilian population. In Moscow, civilians endured the stress of constant air raids, food shortages, and the constant presence of military forces. In the face of the overwhelming Nazi threat, the Soviet government had implemented measures to organize and control the civilian population, including widespread evacuations and mobilization for defense. While the Soviet military managed to mount a successful defense of Moscow, the civilian experience continued to deteriorate across the Soviet Union. As the Germans pressed forward, they continued to implement brutal occupation policies in the territories they controlled. The mass murder of Jews, Romani people, and Soviet officials became routine as the Nazis sought to implement their racial policies and eliminate perceived enemies. The Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads, followed the German army's advance, carrying out mass executions in cities and towns. In the occupied regions, the civilian population faced the daily threat of violence, displacement, and forced labor. The escalation of the conflict also had significant political and psychological consequences for civilians. The initial optimism that some Soviet civilians had felt during the early days of the German invasion, particularly in the western parts of the Soviet Union, was replaced with the harsh reality of occupation. The belief that the Germans would bring an end to Soviet oppression was quickly shattered as the Germans imposed their own brutal regime. The occupation was not one of liberation, but of systematic terror, with civilians treated as subhuman and subject to the whims of their German captors. In areas like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, where Soviet repression had been harsh, the reality of Nazi occupation proved far worse, with local populations experiencing both political and racial persecution. In addition to the violence of occupation, civilians were increasingly subjected to forced labor. As the Germans sought to exploit the resources of the occupied territories, Soviet civilians were forced into labor camps to work for the Nazi war machine. Many of these civilians were used for the construction of military infrastructure, the repair of railways, and the production of armaments. For those who remained behind in occupied territories, survival meant adapting to a life under constant repression, where every action was monitored and any sign of resistance could result in death. As the Germans expanded their reach across the Soviet Union, they also faced growing partisan resistance. In the rural areas and forests, Soviet partisans began to engage in guerrilla warfare, attacking German supply lines, ambushing patrols, and sabotaging infrastructure. The partisan movement, initially small and disorganized, became a significant thorn in the side of the German military as it expanded its operations. Civilians, often at great personal risk, supported the partisan movement by providing shelter, food, and intelligence. In return, the Germans launched brutal reprisals against any suspected partisans or civilians who had assisted them. Entire villages were destroyed, and civilians were executed or sent to labor camps. The Nazis used these tactics to attempt to stamp out resistance, but were ultimately unable to completely suppress the growing partisan movement. For the civilians living in these areas, the war became a constant cycle of suffering. They were caught between the advancing German forces, the retreating Soviet army, and the growing partisan resistance. Forced evacuations, the threat of execution, starvation, and disease became daily realities. In the face of all this, however, many civilians found ways to adapt. Despite the terror and the brutality of both the German and Soviet forces, civilians in the occupied territories showed incredible resilience. They found ways to resist, whether through supporting the partisan groups or by simply enduring the harsh conditions. The escalation of the conflict brought not only a physical toll, but also an emotional and psychological one. Civilians who had lived through the early months of the war found themselves trapped in a world where survival was the only goal. The constant fear of death, the destruction of homes, and the loss of loved ones left deep scars on the population. For many, the war was not just a battle between armies, but a battle for the very survival of their families and communities. The resilience of the civilian population, despite the overwhelming odds and constant suffering, became a defining feature of the Soviet resistance and ultimately contributed to the eventual defeat of the German invaders. As 1942 began, Operation Barbarossa, initially planned as a swift and decisive invasion, had turned into a protracted war of attrition, with the Germans unable to deliver the quick victory they had expected. The peak of the campaign came during the summer of 1942, as the German military, now firmly entrenched in Soviet territory, sought to secure its strategic objectives. For the Soviet civilian population, this was the most devastating period of the war, marked by brutal German offensives, systematic destruction, and mass displacements. The vast expanse of Soviet land, combined with the resilience of its population, would ensure that this phase of the conflict was far from the expected rapid collapse of the Soviet state. By mid-1942, the Germans had shifted their focus from the center of the Soviet Union to its southern regions, particularly the oil-rich Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. Hitler's obsession with securing the oil fields of the Caucasus was part of a broader plan to cripple the Soviet war economy and secure vital resources for the German war effort. However, the failure to secure a decisive victory in the early stages of the campaign left the Wehrmacht spread thin, unable to maintain the momentum needed to achieve these goals. For the civilian population in the south of the Soviet Union, this was a time of intense hardship. As the Germans advanced toward Stalingrad, the city became the focal point of Soviet resistance. Civilians in Stalingrad were called upon to support the military effort, building defenses, fortifying buildings, and preparing for what would become one of the most vicious battles of the entire war. The city, located on the banks of the Volga River, held immense strategic and symbolic significance. Stalin ordered that the city be defended at all costs, and the civilian population, along with the Red Army, dug in to resist the advancing German forces. The Battle of Stalingrad, which would become one of the most iconic confrontations of the war, began in the summer of 1942. The German forces, under General Friedrich Paulus, began their assault on the city with the goal of capturing it by August. The German military expected the city to fall within weeks, but the resilience of the Soviet defenders, bolstered by civilian labor and fortifications, slowed the advance. Civilians in the city lived through the constant threat of bombardment, air raids, and street fighting as the battle for Stalingrad devolved into a brutal urban siege. In addition to the horrors of the siege itself, the civilians living in Stalingrad and surrounding areas suffered from the relentless German air raids. The Luftwaffe, using bombers to destroy key infrastructure and morale, targeted factories, transportation hubs, and residential areas. Civilians, unable to escape the fighting, were caught in the crossfire, with tens of thousands being killed in the raids. The fighting in the city was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The German forces, unable to break the Soviet defense, were bogged down in an urban war of attrition. The civilians trapped in the city faced starvation, disease, and death, but their determination to resist was unwavering. Outside Stalingrad, the situation was equally dire. The Germans pushed deeper into the Caucasus, hoping to secure the oil fields and cut off Soviet resources. However, the Soviet leadership, aware of the strategic importance of the region, began to shift their forces to the south, and by the fall of 1942, Soviet forces began to push back. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched in the winter of 1942–43, would become a turning point in the war. The German Sixth Army, already overstretched and under-resourced, found itself encircled by Soviet forces. The civilians caught in the German retreat were left to suffer as the Soviet army advanced, and many were forced to flee their homes once again. The civilian experience during this period was defined by forced displacement, suffering, and the constant threat of death. In areas like Ukraine, where the Germans had initially been welcomed as liberators, the reality of Nazi occupation became starkly clear. Entire villages were destroyed in retaliation for resistance efforts, and civilians were either executed, deported, or conscripted into forced labor. The brutality of the German occupation was further demonstrated in the mass execution of Jews, Romani people, and Soviet prisoners of war. The Holocaust, which had already devastated Jewish communities in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, extended into the Soviet Union as the Germans implemented their genocidal policies. Civilians living in the path of the German advance, particularly in areas like the Donbass region and southern Ukraine, were subjected to brutal treatment by the German military. The destruction of infrastructure, including railways, power plants, and agricultural resources, left many civilians without food, shelter, or medical care. The civilian death toll as a result of violence, famine, and disease mounted rapidly. In addition, the Soviet government continued to implement its scorched earth policy, destroying crops, farms, and resources to deny the Germans the ability to sustain their occupation. While this policy hindered the Germans, it also took a heavy toll on the civilian population, further exacerbating the already dire conditions. By the end of 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had reached its climax. The German forces, trapped in a pincer movement by Soviet forces, began to crumble. The city, once a symbol of Soviet defiance, became a symbol of German defeat. For the civilians who had lived through the siege, the victory at Stalingrad was a bittersweet moment. While the Soviet victory offered hope for liberation, the devastation of the city and the loss of life were immeasurable. The German withdrawal from the southern Soviet Union and the eventual defeat at Stalingrad marked a significant turning point in the war. For the civilians who had survived the horrors of the German occupation, the retreat of the Wehrmacht was a moment of both relief and uncertainty. The war was far from over, but the loss of Stalingrad dealt a severe blow to the German military, and the Soviet counteroffensive set the stage for the eventual liberation of Soviet territories and the defeat of Nazi Germany. As the battle for Stalingrad raged on, the civilians who had endured the violence of occupation, bombardment, and starvation became an essential part of the Soviet war effort. They rebuilt their homes, their cities, and their communities, all while continuing to support the Red Army in any way possible. The resilience of the Soviet people, particularly the civilians who endured the worst of the war, played a pivotal role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The victory at Stalingrad, while costly, proved that the Soviet Union could stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds and resist the most powerful military force in the world. For the civilian population, the peak of the campaign in 1942 was a period of immense suffering, but also one of extraordinary resilience. The war was not only a military struggle but a struggle for survival, and the determination of the Soviet people would ultimately shape the outcome of the conflict. The German defeat at Stalingrad was a victory for both the Red Army and the civilians who had borne the brunt of the war. The psychological and strategic impact of this victory would be felt throughout the remainder of the conflict, as the Soviets began to push the Germans back and reclaim their homeland. The vast scale of destruction brought by the German invasion, combined with the initial military setbacks, left the Soviet Union facing not only an external military threat, but an internal collapse of civilian infrastructure. By late 1941 and into 1942, as the German forces pressed deeper into Soviet territory, the civilian population found itself increasingly involved in the war effort, either through organized resistance or survival in the harshest conditions. The Soviets quickly adapted to this new phase of conflict, with civilians forced to endure a combination of occupation, forced labor, and the brutal realities of a prolonged war of attrition. The initial phases of the German invasion, characterized by rapid advances and encirclements, overwhelmed Soviet defenses and left the civilian population struggling to adapt to the new situation. However, the scale of the occupation, particularly in the Western Soviet territories, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of southern Russia, meant that the war quickly became one of both survival and active resistance for millions of civilians. In areas where the German occupation was firmly established, such as Kiev and Smolensk, civilians faced mass executions, forced relocations, and the systematic extermination of ethnic minorities, particularly Jews. Thousands of civilians were rounded up and executed in public displays of Nazi power, as Einsatzgruppen, death squads, followed the advancing German forces to carry out mass murders. Whole villages were razed to the ground in retaliation for partisan activity, and German forces used hostages as leverage to prevent the civilian population from aiding the resistance. But amid the horrors of occupation, a growing partisan movement began to emerge in the occupied territories. Partisan groups, made up of Soviet soldiers who had escaped the German encirclements, as well as local civilians, engaged in a war of attrition against the Germans. These guerrilla fighters carried out sabotage, ambushed German patrols, destroyed railways and communication lines, and conducted attacks on German supply convoys. However, partisan activities came at great personal risk. Civilians found themselves caught between two hostile forces. One side, the German occupiers, used collective punishment and executions, while the Soviet forces, though less present in the early stages of the occupation, relied on civilians to sustain the resistance effort. For the civilian population, survival meant adapting to the changing landscape of war. In rural areas and forests, many civilians fled their homes to seek shelter from the advancing Germans. Some families took refuge in the forests, hiding from the German forces and working with the partisans to provide supplies and intelligence. These families often lived off the land, foraging for food, and even in the harshest conditions, their determination to resist the occupation remained strong. Others found refuge in the Soviet interior, but the large-scale evacuations led to further displacement and severe shortages of food and shelter in the rear areas. Civilians were also pressed into labor by both the Germans and the Soviet authorities. For the Germans, the forced labor of Soviet civilians was essential to the war effort. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians were sent to labor camps, where they worked in grueling conditions, producing munitions, building infrastructure, and supporting the German war machine. The labor camps were notorious for their brutal conditions, where disease, malnutrition, and harsh punishment took a devastating toll on the prisoners. Women and children were also conscripted into forced labor, often working in factories or agricultural fields. In the Soviet Union, forced labor was also implemented, although with the goal of maintaining wartime production and supporting the military. Civilians in areas that were not directly occupied by the Germans were mobilized into the war effort, working in factories to produce weapons, vehicles, and supplies. The Soviet government emphasized total war mobilization, demanding the contribution of every able-bodied civilian to the war effort. Women, in particular, took on essential roles, working in factories, farms, and military hospitals. The Soviet leadership, however, placed considerable stress on maintaining morale and securing the population's support, often at the cost of harsh conditions and heavy labor. As the Soviet military began to reorganize and prepare for a counteroffensive, the importance of civilian support became even clearer. In the territories under German control, the Soviet Union's ability to organize resistance efforts relied heavily on the civilian population. This included providing shelter, food, and information to the partisans, as well as offering intelligence about German movements. Many civilians, despite the risks, cooperated with the resistance, often with the knowledge that their actions could lead to retaliation and punishment. The Soviet Union's ability to sustain the partisan movement and organize underground networks of resistance was directly linked to the resourcefulness of the civilian population. Partisan movements, particularly in the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, grew in strength as the war continued. These groups, although small compared to the regular Soviet military, were an important part of the broader struggle. Partisans launched raids on German supply lines, attacked military posts, and sabotaged railways. These acts of resistance, though often unsuccessful in changing the overall course of the war, served to undermine German morale and disrupt their operations. They also offered hope to the civilian population, showing that despite the occupation, the spirit of resistance was alive. The Soviet Union's response to the civilian challenges of occupation and resistance was multifaceted. The government, though faced with internal struggles and the aftermath of Stalin's purges, began to realize the importance of rallying the population behind the war effort. While the leadership emphasized victory over the Germans, it also faced the reality of civilian hardship. Large-scale evacuations were carried out to move both industrial facilities and populations out of the most vulnerable areas, particularly from cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad. In other regions, such as the Caucasus, the government shifted to implement a policy of total defense, calling on civilians to organize in local militias and support the Red Army's efforts. By the end of 1942, as the Germans faced increasing resistance in the winter months, the civilian population's adaptation to the circumstances of war became more evident. The Red Army had begun to regroup, and Soviet morale was bolstered by the victories at Stalingrad and the successful defense of Moscow. In the territories liberated by Soviet forces, civilians who had endured the horrors of German occupation were finally able to begin the long and difficult process of rebuilding their homes and lives. In the liberated cities, however, destruction remained, and the trauma of occupation left deep psychological scars on the population. The victory at Stalingrad, which marked the first major defeat of the German military, served as a turning point in the conflict. For the civilians in the Soviet Union, the turning of the tide was a moment of renewed hope, but the destruction and suffering that had already been wrought would continue to shape the post-war Soviet society. Although the war effort would continue for several more years, the resilience of the Soviet civilians, who had lived through the worst of the war, became a defining characteristic of the Soviet Union's eventual victory. As the war progressed, the civilian population once again became the backbone of Soviet survival, contributing to the war effort through both passive and active resistance. The tenacity of the people, combined with their resourcefulness and determination to endure, played a significant role in the eventual defeat of the Germans. The Soviet Union's victory in 1945 was not only a military success, but a testament to the adaptability and resilience of its civilian population, whose sacrifices and hardships during the war would be remembered as one of the defining characteristics of the Soviet war effort. The turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, which had been grinding on with horrific consequences for both soldiers and civilians, came not just through strategic military victories, but through the unparalleled resilience of the Soviet people and the mistakes of their German adversaries. By the winter of 1942–43, the tide of the war began to shift dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union. The turning of the momentum in favor of the Soviets would prove to be one of the most pivotal moments in World War II, particularly when viewed through the lens of civilian experience. For the civilian population of the Soviet Union, the turning point was not an immediate liberation, but rather a slow and painful struggle for survival, even as their military counterparts began to gain the upper hand. The winter of 1941–42 had brought about one of the first instances of the Wehrmacht being forced into retreat, as Soviet forces, bolstered by the Siberian divisions and equipped for the harsh winter conditions, launched successful counterattacks that pushed back German forces from Moscow. This was followed by the pivotal Soviet victory at Stalingrad, where months of brutal urban warfare led to the encirclement and eventual surrender of the German Sixth Army in February 1943. However, the impact of these victories on the civilian population would only be fully felt as the war unfolded in the years that followed. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, the German army, despite suffering its first major defeat of the war, was far from finished. The retreating Germans, still occupying vast swaths of Soviet territory, imposed brutal reprisals on the civilian population. The aftermath of the battle marked the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle for control of the Soviet heartland. While the Wehrmacht had lost its initial momentum, it would take time for the full consequences of Soviet victories to be realized on the ground. Civilians in liberated areas were faced with the challenge of rebuilding their homes, their communities, and their lives after years of occupation. As the Red Army began to push back the Germans, the civilian experience shifted from the horrors of occupation to the harsh realities of war-torn landscapes. Civilians in cities and towns that had once been under German control now found themselves subjected to the ravages of war in a different form. Soviet troops, eager to secure and defend the territory they had gained, were often harsh in their treatment of civilians. The scars of both German occupation and the destruction wrought by combat left deep psychological and physical marks on the population. In areas such as Ukraine, where both Soviet and Nazi control had been harshly felt, the transition from one occupying force to another left civilians wary and fearful. While the Soviet military moved westward, liberating territories and pushing the Germans into retreat, the civilian experience remained fraught with challenges. In the months following Stalingrad, partisan activity in the occupied regions surged as Soviet forces sought to undermine German control. The civilian population played a key role in sustaining these resistance efforts, providing vital intelligence, shelter, and resources to the partisans, often at great personal risk. Entire villages, particularly in Belarus and Ukraine, were razed in retaliation for their support of the partisans. The Germans, knowing that their hold on occupied territories was slipping, responded with ever more brutal measures. As Soviet forces advanced, the civilian population was forced to endure not only the violence of war, but the fear of reprisals from both the retreating Germans and their own Soviet liberators. In addition to the direct threats posed by the fighting, civilians also had to cope with the persistent effects of the war on their daily lives. The evacuation of civilians from threatened cities, particularly in the early stages of the conflict, had displaced millions of people. Many refugees found themselves wandering through desolate landscapes, struggling to survive in a world where resources were scarce. The Soviet government, facing its own logistical challenges, struggled to meet the needs of the civilian population, and as a result, millions of civilians found themselves living in conditions of abject poverty and deprivation. As the German forces retreated further into Eastern Europe and eventually into the heart of Germany, the damage inflicted on the civilian population was irrevocable. The death toll continued to rise as both military and civilian casualties mounted. As the Soviets made their way into the former territories of the Third Reich, they discovered the full extent of the destruction that had been wrought by the Nazis. The civilian population in these areas had been subjected to mass executions, forced labor, and the decimation of entire communities. For those civilians who had survived the brutality of the occupation, the aftermath of the retreating Germans was a mixed blessing. While the liberation brought hope of an end to the suffering, it also opened the door to the next phase of the war. A war that would see the Soviet government reassert its control over the territories and populations it had liberated. For many civilians, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, the Soviet return was no guarantee of a better future. The Soviet regime had its own set of repressive policies, including the forced collectivization of agriculture, political purges, and the imposition of strict control over every aspect of life. The turning point in the war was not only military, but ideological. As Soviet forces liberated large parts of Eastern Europe, the Soviet government sought to consolidate its influence over these regions. The populations that had lived under German occupation were subjected to Soviet rule, and while many welcomed the end of Nazi tyranny, the experience of Soviet control left mixed feelings. Some regions, particularly those that had seen significant collaboration with the Germans, faced harsh punishments from the Soviets. Others, particularly in Ukraine and the Baltics, began to foster a sense of national identity and resistance that would continue into the post-war years. One of the most significant impacts of the turning point in the war was the psychological toll on both the Soviet military and civilian population. The brutality of the German occupation, combined with the years of suffering endured under both Nazi and Soviet control, left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the Soviet people. The horrors of the Holocaust, the widespread destruction of Soviet cities and villages, and the forced displacement of millions of people created a sense of trauma that would last for generations. The scars left by the war on the civilian population were not just physical but emotional, and the impact of the conflict was felt long after the Germans were defeated. As the war progressed and the Soviet Union began to push toward victory, the civilian population was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered nation. The harshness of the war, coupled with the Stalinist regime's control over the civilian population, created a complex and often contradictory post-war reality. While Soviet propaganda celebrated the victory over fascism, the reality for many civilians was one of continued hardship and repression. The struggle for survival, which had defined the civilian experience during the war, did not immediately end with the retreat of German forces. The aftermath of the war left civilians grappling with loss, displacement, and the long-term consequences of the brutal conflict. As the Soviet Union began its post-war reconstruction efforts, the legacy of the turning point in the war would continue to shape the country's future. The defeat of the Germans, though a triumph for the Soviet people, was also a reminder of the immense human cost of war. The civilian population, which had borne the brunt of the conflict, would continue to rebuild, but the scars of war would remain, shaping the Soviet Union's collective memory for decades to come. As 1943 progressed, the German defeat at Stalingrad marked a decisive turning point for the Axis forces in the Soviet Union. But the consequences of the war for civilians were far from over. With the Germans pushed back from the Soviet heartland, the liberation of Soviet territory slowly began. Yet, for the civilians who had lived under German occupation for 2 years, the end of the German advance did not immediately bring relief. Instead, they faced the continued hardships of a war that had ravaged their homes, lives, and communities. By 1943, the German retreat had begun, and the Red Army steadily advanced across the Soviet Union's western territories. As Soviet forces liberated cities like Kiev, Smolensk, and others, the civilian experience of the war shifted from occupation to the trauma of liberation. The destruction left behind by the Germans was staggering. Entire cities were destroyed, vast swathes of farmland were rendered barren, and the industrial infrastructure, once the backbone of Soviet production, lay in ruins. The destruction of cities was particularly severe in areas where the Germans had met the most resistance. In cities like Kiev, Kharkiv, and Stalingrad, where some of the heaviest fighting of the war took place, civilian populations endured not just military violence, but also the systematic annihilation of their homes and communities. The Germans had not only sought to destroy Soviet military capability, but to crush the civilian morale through indiscriminate destruction. This scorched earth policy, which had been used in response to Soviet partisan activities, was extended to entire regions, and entire villages and towns were razed to the ground, leaving nothing behind but charred ruins. For the civilians who survived the occupation, the challenge was twofold: survival amid the wreckage and the struggle to rebuild. Many families who had fled from the front lines during the early stages of the German advance returned home, only to find their cities and villages utterly destroyed. Those who had been displaced by the invasion now had to contend with a destroyed infrastructure, food shortages, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The Soviet Union, while now pushing the Germans out, faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just its military, but also its civilian infrastructure. In many cases, the war-torn regions had no access to basic necessities like food, clothing, or medical care. The state attempted to organize large-scale recovery efforts, but with the economy still suffering from years of war, resources were limited. The German withdrawal itself also left a profound impact on civilians. As German forces retreated across Ukraine, Belarus, and into the Baltics, they carried out a brutal scorched earth policy designed to deprive the advancing Soviet forces of vital resources. This meant that entire regions were stripped of their agricultural produce, livestock, and raw materials. The retreating Germans also took thousands of Soviet civilians with them as forced laborers, and many were sent to work in German factories, mines, and on military projects. These forced evacuations and labor assignments contributed to the continuation of civilian suffering long after the German defeat at Stalingrad. When Soviet forces liberated these occupied territories, they found a civilian population exhausted by years of deprivation, fear, and violence. The occupation, although now over, had scarred the psyche of the people. In cities like Kiev, the first Soviet soldiers to arrive were greeted with mixed feelings. While some civilians celebrated their liberation from the Germans, others remained wary, recalling the brutality of both the Germans and the Stalinist purges that had preceded the invasion. It was a delicate moment. The Soviet authorities sought to reassert their control and rebuild, but the scars of both Nazi occupation and Soviet repression left a complicated legacy. In regions like Ukraine and the Baltics, where collaboration with the Germans had been prevalent, the Soviets faced a significant challenge in reconsolidating power. The war had created a divide among the civilian population, with some areas having seen significant cooperation with the Nazis, while others had experienced brutal Soviet rule. These tensions would only escalate in the years following the war, as the Soviet government sought to re-establish its authority in newly liberated territories. In some places, civilian resistance to Soviet rule began to rise, particularly in areas where nationalist movements had gained ground during the occupation. The experience of Soviet repression and Nazi collaboration made these areas complex to govern and brought about tensions that would influence Soviet policy for decades. Civilians who had lived through both the brutal German occupation and the harsh Soviet post-war policies faced an uncertain future. The war had destroyed not just physical structures, but entire social systems. Families had been torn apart by the violence of both the German and Soviet forces. People who had survived occupation now found themselves struggling to piece together their shattered lives, often with few resources and little hope for the future. Even as the Red Army began to liberate regions under Nazi control, the suffering of civilians continued. The Soviet leadership, under Joseph Stalin, focused heavily on the military aspects of victory, while paying little attention to the immense civilian hardship in the liberated areas. While the Soviet propaganda machine glorified the heroic victory over fascism, it often overlooked the human costs of the war. The aftermath of the German occupation in the Soviet territories was a period of economic and social turmoil. The post-war reconstruction efforts were further complicated by the Soviet government's harsh control over civilian life, particularly in the occupied territories, where dissent against Soviet policies was not tolerated. For many civilians, the immediate consequences of liberation were devastating. Refugees from the front lines faced a long and difficult journey back to their homes, only to find them destroyed. The psychological toll of years of occupation, combined with the subsequent reintegration into Soviet life, left deep scars on the civilian population. The trauma of the war was not just physical. The emotional and psychological toll was profound, as entire communities struggled to rebuild their lives in the wake of the violence they had endured. The Soviet Union's post-war recovery was slow and uneven. Cities and villages that had once been centers of Soviet power and culture now lay in ruins. Agriculture, once a pillar of the Soviet economy, was devastated by the scorched earth tactics of the German forces. The displacement of millions of civilians and the destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals created a humanitarian crisis that lasted for years after the war ended. Soviet authorities focused on rebuilding the military-industrial complex, but the recovery of civilian life was far slower, and the population continued to live under tight control, with the threat of purges and repression lingering in the background. By 1944, the Soviet Union had begun to push the Germans back across Eastern Europe, but for the civilian population, the war was not over. Even as the Germans retreated, they left a lasting legacy of destruction and death. The war had not only decimated the male population, but had also left millions of women and children to carry the burden of rebuilding society. The Soviet government's response, while focused on military victory, failed to address the deep psychological and social consequences of the war on the civilian population. Many communities that had endured the worst of the occupation were left to rebuild from the ground up without much in the way of resources, support, or aid. The scars of Operation Barbarossa, both physical and emotional, would remain with the Soviet population long after the guns fell silent. As the war entered its final years, the civilian population had already endured unimaginable suffering. The liberation of Soviet territories, while crucial to the war effort, did little to mitigate the devastation felt by those who had lived through the occupation. The Soviet Union would go on to achieve victory over Nazi Germany, but the war's aftermath left a profound impact on both the survivors and the future of the Soviet state. For many, the trauma of the occupation and the brutal war was something that would never be fully overcome, and the legacies of these experiences would continue to shape the Soviet Union for years to come. The conclusion of World War II and the retreat of German forces from the Soviet Union left the country both victorious and deeply scarred. The civilian population, which had borne the brunt of the conflict from the outset, faced a long road to recovery. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa, the brutal invasion that had brought the war to Soviet soil, would have lasting effects on the Soviet Union's identity, its political landscape, and its relationship with the broader world. This final part of the campaign's legacy is not just about military victories, but also about the far-reaching consequences for the civilians who lived through the occupation and subsequent Soviet efforts to rebuild. The human cost of the war was staggering. It is estimated that approximately 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives during World War II, with civilians accounting for a large portion of these casualties. The destruction of entire cities, the systemic genocide of ethnic minorities, and the forced labor and deportations all contributed to the immense loss of life. In the areas most affected by the German occupation, entire communities were wiped out, leaving deep emotional scars. The toll of occupation, mass executions, and forced displacements fundamentally altered the fabric of Soviet society. Millions were left without homes, families were torn apart, and the psychological trauma of war persisted for years to come. The reconstruction efforts following the war, while impressive in many ways, were also fraught with difficulties. Soviet leaders, particularly Joseph Stalin, recognized the need to rebuild the country not only militarily, but economically and socially. However, the challenges were immense. The war had decimated Soviet infrastructure. Factories, railways, farms, and utilities were either destroyed or left in disrepair. The agricultural sector, essential to the Soviet economy, had been severely disrupted by both the scorched earth tactics of the Germans and the demands of war production. In many areas, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, the land was left barren, and the population struggled to grow enough food to sustain itself. Despite the immense challenges, the Soviet Union embarked on an ambitious program of industrialization and recovery. Factories were rebuilt, railways were repaired, and the country's heavy industry was revitalized. However, this recovery came at a price. The Soviet leadership's focus on rebuilding the military-industrial complex, while ensuring that resources were directed toward defense, meant that the needs of the civilian population often took a back seat. Many civilians who had been displaced during the war found it difficult to return to their homes, and those who had lived through the worst of the occupation faced harsh living conditions for years to come. The burden of war, economic hardship, and political repression was something that Soviet society would grapple with for decades. The Soviet Union's war effort, while ultimately successful, had also marked the deepening of Stalin's authoritarian rule. The horrors of the war, combined with the brutality of Stalin's purges and political repression, had created a climate of fear and conformity. Even after the war ended, the Soviet regime maintained tight control over its population, with little room for dissent or individual expression. The government's focus on rebuilding the nation often overshadowed the lived experiences of the millions of civilians who had suffered under both Nazi and Soviet control. The stories of those who had endured the occupation, the brutality of the war, and the challenges of post-war life were largely ignored in the official narrative. The post-war Soviet government also sought to impose a particular interpretation of the war's legacy. The victory over Nazi Germany became the cornerstone of Soviet national pride and a central theme in Soviet propaganda. Victory Day, celebrated on May 9th each year, became a national holiday, and the Soviet Union commemorated the sacrifices made by both the military and civilians in the fight against fascism. Monuments to the fallen were erected across the country, and the memory of the Great Patriotic War was used to foster a sense of unity and national identity. However, this official narrative glossed over many aspects of the war, particularly the experiences of civilians during the occupation, as well as the post-war suffering that many endured. For the civilian population, the legacy of the war was complex. Many Soviet citizens, particularly those who had lived in the occupied territories, were left with memories of the destruction, the trauma, and the violence of the war. The forced relocations, the mass executions, the destruction of their homes, and the loss of loved ones left deep psychological scars. The Soviet government's attempts to rebuild the country, while necessary for the war effort, did little to address the emotional and social trauma that the civilian population had endured. While the Soviet Union emerged victorious, the war had reshaped the lives of its people in ways that could not easily be overcome. The war also had a lasting impact on Soviet foreign policy. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, emerged from World War II as one of the two superpowers alongside the United States. The victory over Nazi Germany gave the Soviet Union a sense of strength and legitimacy on the world stage, but it also laid the groundwork for the Cold War. The Soviet Union's focus on securing its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and its efforts to export communism to other parts of the world would shape its foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The Soviet Union's role in the defeat of Nazi Germany became central to its self-image, but the internal challenges of rebuilding and the ongoing repression of its population remained major concerns. For the civilian population in the Soviet Union, the post-war period was marked by a complex mixture of pride in the victory and ongoing hardship. While the war's official end in 1945 brought a sense of national pride, for many people, the aftermath of the conflict was characterized by deprivation, fear, and the struggle for survival. In the years following the war, the Soviet leadership's focus on maintaining tight control over the population and its refusal to acknowledge the full scope of civilian suffering meant that many of the most important aspects of the civilian experience were left out of the public discourse. The enduring legacy of Operation Barbarossa and the Great Patriotic War would continue to shape Soviet society throughout the Cold War. The scars left by the war were not just physical but psychological, and the trauma of occupation, violence, and loss continued to resonate through Soviet culture and identity. The memory of the war and the sacrifices made by civilians was central to the Soviet narrative of victory. However, the true costs of the war, borne by millions of civilians, were often obscured in favor of a narrative that glorified military victory and the resilience of the Soviet people. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union began to rebuild, but the pain of the civilian experience, of those who had lived through the destruction, displacement, and trauma, remained. The war had forever altered the trajectory of Soviet history, and its legacy, for better or worse, would continue to influence the Soviet Union for decades to come. Even as the country moved toward a new era of industrialization, political repression, and global competition, the legacy of Operation Barbarossa remained etched in the minds of the survivors. The war had cost the Soviet Union nearly everything, but in the end, it was a victory that would define not only the Soviet Union's place in the world, but the very soul of its people.